thank you all so much for coming. We're going to get started. I think that clock is a little bit off, which goes with the room tonight, where we don't have any microphones, as we've announced to a lot of people. So thank you for your patience. It's perfect as we talk about public education that we're all experiencing a little bit of what our teachers, our educators, and administrators sometimes have to go through without having all of the technology and equipment that they need. But in any event, I'm Becky Michaels. I'm one of the co-presidents of the Amherst Education Foundation. We are thrilled to be hosting this event tonight, which is a forum with our candidates on education at all levels. Our moderator tonight is Rebecca Woodland. She is an associate professor of education in the School of Education at UMass. She did a wonderful forum for us a couple of years ago, and we're thrilled to have her here again tonight. Just quickly, a little bit about Amherst Education Foundation, if you're not aware yet. We are a nonprofit, fully volunteer-run organization. We are entering our 25th year this year. We generally, our job is to collect money and funds from the community and then give it back to the public schools in the form of grants. Those grants are applied for by educators and administrators in the schools. We sort through them and then are able to give grants, generally about $5,000 to a number of the people a number of the applications that come in. There are often many that we can't fund, so we're constantly raising money and trying to fund even more. This year we're really excited about the grants that we're funding, which include a gardening program in the elementary schools, an incredible restorative justice program in the high school that's really launching the high school's new way of looking at discipline. That's one of the biggest grants we've given. It was $10,000 to the high school for that. We also bought a new light board for the high school auditorium, which if you go to any of the events there, you'll have an opportunity to appreciate the new ways that they can enhance sound and light in that auditorium. And there is one more, which I'm forgetting right now, but will come to me at some point. But in any event, we are thrilled to have you all here, and I'll let Rebecca introduce our candidates to you, and we'll get started.
Great. Thank you, Becky. As Becky said, we have no advanced technology to speak of. Most of our advanced technology is in our pocket with our smartphones, and that's a reminder right now to please silence yourselves. Like we're at Cinemark, we want to silence our cell phones so that they don't go off inadvertently during the event. If you are sitting at the back and want to move forward, or sitting on the side and come in, that would be welcomed by the candidates, only because originally we had the tables on the stage, but because we don't have any microphones, we're all going to have to project. So the closer we huddle, even though that's body heat, the better it is to hear. And so if you would like to move forward, please do, or move in, that would be great. I want to especially thank Jennifer Page and Becky Michaels, the co-presidents of AEF, for hosting this event. Our candidates, wonderful Mindy Domb and Nakajima, who are doing a lot of forums, but not necessarily focused on education and schooling. So I find this to be quite an auspicious event, because it is rare that a group of citizens, neighbors, people come together to focus on what I consider to be the most, or one of the most important issues and topics that we have in society, and that's schooling and education. Because schooling is one of those last places, or only places, where all of our cultural values play out, or a lot of them. And that we have to come together across different cultural lines and demographics to engage in tough issues. Important ones. What do we want for our children? What do we want them to learn? So I'm really excited to be here tonight, and really thank the two of you for participating and being candidates in this event. To explain the format, we're going to start with introductions. They will introduce themselves. They will have 3 minutes to introduce themselves. I have a prompt for them that they'll respond to. Then we'll ask pre-planned questions. There are 6 of them, and the way it will work is that one of the candidates will have 2 minutes to respond, the other candidate will have another 2 minutes to respond, then the original candidate will have an additional minute because something came to them that they want to add, and then, maybe, right? And then the other candidate will also have a stroke of genius and have another minute to share. So it'll be up to 2 minutes, then up to 2 minutes, up to 1 minute, up to 1 minute, then we stop. I will be cueing the candidates that when they have 1 minute left, when they have 30 seconds left, and when it's time to stop. And we're moving to the next question. Then, there will be time for audience questions. And the way that we're doing audience questions are that Becky and Jennifer, where's Jennifer? Sorry, okay, great. Becky and Jennifer have 3x5 cards. They're going to now randomly disperse them out so that everybody can have a card. And if there's a question that you want to ask, write it on the card. No names, no emails, nothing like that, just your question. You may want to, and so once you write your question, all you have to do is hold it up in the air, and Becky or Jennifer will pick it up. But let me tell you this, we're not doing audience questions till about 45 minutes in. So you may want to hold off on writing your question because you may have something answered for you and you want to ask something different. Okay? But there are cards coming around, and all you have to do is raise it up, and Becky and Jennifer will look, and they will come to you to pick up the card. Okay? All right. Are we ready? And if you cannot hear any of us for some reason, can you let us know, please, that you cannot hear us, and we will continue to try to project much louder. Great. Welcome, Eric, and welcome, Mindy.
Thank you.
Yeah. Could you please briefly introduce yourselves, your position on the value of education or importance of education, and a story or anecdote about a personal educational experience of yours that might help us to understand your position on the value or importance of education. 3 minutes. Eric, you go first.
Thank you very much. Thanks for Amherst Education Foundation for hosting us tonight, for all of you to being here. Many of you already know me. I'm chair of the regional school committee, and I have a background in government and such like that. I grew up in town. So I'm not going to talk about any of that. I'm going to go straight to the question. For me, education, both K through 12 and higher education, is the most important issue and the most important thing that I care about. I'm going to tell you 2 quick anecdotes that I honestly never speak about publicly. One, this one I literally never spoke about publicly, ever, is after my parents got divorced and we moved to Amherst, the divorce is rough. My mom remarried someone, a stepfather, who was an extraordinarily difficult person to be around. Home life was very rough, and I often felt deeply undervalued as a person, as a child. The Amherst Public Schools essentially saved my life because it was a refuge, it was a place I could go and be supported, it was a home. And in fact, that my mom taught at Fall River made it really doubly a home because often there were teachers around who were colleagues who nurtured and supported me. It was a place where I could excel and feel valued independent of other messages I was receiving in my life. I literally never talk about this because it's so deeply personal, but it's something that for me, it drives me in everything I do around supporting public education in our schools and my work in the school committee. The second story is later on, when I was at UMass, I was really involved as an activist and the student trustee at UMass. I didn't pay attention to my studies, and I literally flunked out of college. I was smart, and I was also pretty arrogant about what I thought I could do and how I could make the system work on my behalf. And I was wrong, and I needed to grow up. When I was working to get back into college, what I found was it was extraordinarily difficult to do. The hurdles that were in place for me to go continuing education, take classes, and get back in. I finally got back in. I went to UMass Amherst. I finished my degree, got very high grades, and went to UC Berkeley for graduate school. It propelled everything else in my career. Without UMass, and without UMass being accessible, without it being a place that was open to people and that was oriented towards making sure people could be included and have an opportunity, I don't know where I would have been. But the thing, when I got in, the immediate thing that occurred to me that I knew for a fact was that there were tens of thousands of other people, hundreds of thousands, and in our country, millions of people who, for whatever life circumstance, probably were discouraged before they were able to break through the walls that they needed to do to get back into school or to get into school or to pay for school. And it made me feel an absolute passion for ensuring that our system works for people and that people can get a good education, be supported, and do so without exorbitant debt, and be supported as human beings and nurtured as them.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Thank you to AEF, not only for this evening, but for being such an extraordinary partner and contributor to the Amherst schools, to our students, our teachers, and our community. And Eric, thank you for sharing that information next to me. Appreciate that. I am a proud parent of 2 Amherst Public School graduates, and my family moved here 20 years ago, like many people, for the schools. I believe public education is the bedrock of democracy. Its potential to be an economic equalizer is undeniable. It changes lives, it changes our Commonwealth, and in Massachusetts, it's our constitutional right. I'm going to repeat that for the people in the back row. In Massachusetts, public education is our constitutional right. My background is in public health, adult learning, and access to health care and food. My experience includes being a nonprofit leader, a congressional aide, a DPH administrator, a coalition builder, a community organizer, and a public health educator. I want to bring my advocacy, coalition building skills, and knowledge gained from working inside and outside of government on the front lines of some of the most important issues of our time, and I want to bring it to the State House on behalf of the constituents of the 3rd Hampshire District. I am proud to have the endorsement of the Massachusetts Teachers Association. I was thinking about the prompt before we came, because we did have a heads up on it. And I was thinking about the time that, for a very short time, I was an interim director of a statewide program that worked with health and human service providers and educators to offer safe spaces for LGBTQ youth in Massachusetts. And for me, the most impactful part of that directorship and that tenure wasn't only meeting all the educators who wanted to be part of that and who wanted to be involved in offering that support, but it was the research upon which that program was based. And that research showed, I don't know what that means.
It means 1 minute left.
Thank you.
No problem.
It was like, and that the research.
That's something else.
Thank you. I'll be prepared. The research that was the foundation for that program showed that all it took was one adult, one caring adult, who accepted and saw a child, an LGBT teen, for that child to have resilience in their life. Now, sometimes that one adult.
30 seconds.
Thank you. Sometimes that one adult was a parent, but oftentimes it was an educator. And working with those educators around building that resilience was sort of empowering to me to know that we were on this journey together of transformation and acceptance. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, those were the opening statements, so now we'll go into the questions. Okay, and all they have are broad categories of the questions, not the specific question in advance. So, and you'll have 2 minutes to respond, and then 2 minutes to respond, and then 1 minute, and then 1 minute. Okay, so this is a biggie. We'll start with a biggie. Nice light question, but there are many espoused purposes for a state system of schooling, including delivering a standardized curriculum so that all students have access to the same shared knowledge and skills, socializing children, and teaching students to embrace diversity and the ability to empathize and communicate with one another, including ensuring that students acquire the skills and values of democracy so as to perform their responsibilities as informed and engaged citizens. There are inherent tensions among and between these espoused purposes, and there are only so many resources. In fact, there's a broad conversation afoot nationally about what the right to an education should look like. Lawsuits have gone up the chain in 7 states currently by citizens and parents with claims about the denial of an appropriate education, including their denial of a right to literacy, their right to a standardized curriculum, and their right to diversity and desegregation. So I ask you, could you please share with us your thoughts on the value and fundamental purposes of schooling? Who is schooling for, and what is most important for students to learn? And Eric, we will start with you.
Small question.
Small, light.
One of the things that I love about the Amherst Regional School District is the fact that we invest a lot and we try to do a lot, but one of the reasons is because we encompass a broad spectrum of the priorities you just described. I mean, what you're trying to do, I think, is provide an environment in which the whole child is nurtured to succeed and develop themselves, bringing with them into the school building, in the school district, whatever they bring personally, what they bring from their home, and they need to be met on an individualized basis in that school with resources and programs that can both support excellence and acceleration, depending on where they are, but also remediation and support where it needs to be. So that includes everything from social and emotional learning, which I think is absolutely critical, to obviously core academic programs, but even then, if you think about some of the things we're doing in academic programming, it itself is also highly customized and flexible in how it's thinking about where a child is doing well, where they're not doing well. It's one of the reasons why we're doing co-teaching in the elementary school level now. I think democracy and other things like that are important, but I think the value that comes through civically and in a community comes through the fact that it is public education, the fact that it's something where all the children of the community, or almost all, it's 96%, come into the door with their backgrounds, with their educational, social, linguistic, and other needs, and get to exchange with one another who they are and learn and share with each other. So I think that's, I mean, to me, the trouble with schooling, and it's really challenging, is you got to do all those things. It is one of the reasons why, by the way, I personally would like to dial back the standardized testing, because I think the more emphasis on the MCAS and standardized testing takes away from your ability to do these other things well.
This is a huge question.
It is
You know, it's a dissertation kind of question, and it's in 2 minutes. So I do believe that the role of public education is not only to give every child a shared experience and a similar curriculum, if not identical, so that people have equal access to information, but I think it's also the role of the schools to help students be engaged participants in our democracy. And I think that school teaches the skills that allow us to do that. It allows us to be critical thinkers. It allows us to identify skills to collect information, assess sources of information, and then act on that information. As a parent of kids who went through public education, I often had conflicts when I thought that, in fact, the school wasn't giving them those long-range skills and was only looking at the short-range skills. On the other hand, I have to say, I wholeheartedly not only support, but feel indebted to the Amherst Public Schools for their rich curricula around arts and music, as well as the performing arts. Those are the kinds of classes that can engage students that aren't necessarily academically oriented or academically inspired. And those are the kinds of classes that can give students a sense of their own passion and what they want to do in the rest of their life. And that's happened in our family. I don't often kind of say it, so if it's happened in my family, it can happen in yours. But I know that arts, music, helps kids feel engaged. So for my view, in terms of what I would expect, I think that the kids who are learning in Amherst schools should be learning similar kinds of skills and information to the kids who live in Brockton. And it shouldn't depend on our property values, what our kids learn and what information they have access to, and how much of an advantage they have to participate in democracy.
Thank you. 1 minute.
Well, one of the reasons why, I mean, I actually agree with what Mindy just said. I mean, one of the reasons why I really put front and center in my campaign fully funding our schools and also ending the local district school funding for charter schools and rebalancing how we're funding schools is because we're strained every year. When you look at what's happening to our school budgets, we do have to cut back electives. We're strained to ensure we can provide enough counseling or support services. I love a...
30 seconds.
Okay, I got it. It's distracting. But it's okay. It's good. It's good information.
Someone's got to do it.
I agree with
I was going to
that.
say, it's just, I love the fact that AEF was able to invest in restorative justice, but it's the kind of thing we should be doing anyway. The reality is we need an AEF to do this, and they're a gem, but it's because we don't have appropriate funding otherwise. So this is one of those things, and don't even get me on universal preschool, because the reality is we're never getting on that road unless we make significantly different priorities.
So a good example for me to why we need to have similar, if not identical, curriculum throughout the Commonwealth is the whole idea of comprehensive sexuality education in schools that's age appropriate, LGBT inclusive, and comprehensive. Because a community like ours will say, sure, let's do that. And our kids will benefit from it. And in another community, they may be reluctant. They may need more parent training, more teacher training to be able to bring them along. But those students still deserve that information so that they can grow up to be healthy adults and make good decisions. So I'm a big proponent for curricula to sort of be similar, if not identical. And that's sort of, a kind of a hedging. But I want to make sure that every student has the same opportunity to the same information that's going to allow them to lead healthy and fulfilling lives.
Thank you. And Mindy, we're going to start with you on this next question, which is about school finance. Okay, in October 2015, a commission appointed by the legislature identified 4 areas where our current state funding formula underestimates the cost of educating students today. And those 4 areas are health insurance, special education, English language learners, and low-income students. Costs to fix these areas were estimated at $1 to $2 billion. A bill to address the first 2 of these areas died at the end of this past legislative session. What is your position on these proposed changes to the funding formula, and how would the state afford to make them? Specifically, do you see any areas where the legislature could make modifications to the budget to help pay for them?
That's a great question, and that's not such a dissertation-related question.
Thank you.
So I completely support the Commission's recommendations to fully fund and accurately fund the 4 sections of the chapter of the budget for public schools. This formula was made 25 years ago. It was supposed to be revised every 4 years. It never has been. Meanwhile, look at what healthcare costs have done since in the past 25 years. That just gives you a little bit of a sense, not even with the English language learners, special needs, as well as low-income folks. It needs to be changed. We have failed. This isn't even just like a broken system. This is a broken promise to the people of Massachusetts and to the children of the Commonwealth. So I appreciate the question about where are we going to find the money. I wish we asked that question about a lot of other things too. I think the first thing is we have to come to consensus that we're going to keep the promise. And that, and when I get, so the fact that this died, and it died in the House, not in the Senate. So whoever gets elected, it's on our laps. There are several things that didn't happen at the end of the last session. This is one of them that will be on my to-do list. So when I go, if I'm elected, when I go in January, I won't be the only one. 2/3 apparently of the House supported these changes. I'm going to find those other folks. And we're going to try to move this onto the floor so that the House can vote on it with a roll call vote so that the people of Massachusetts can see who's keeping the promise and who's not. How are we going to fund it? I'm going to quickly kind of pivot, and I'll take my minute later. I'm a proponent of a progressive tax. I would have supported the Fair Share Amendment. I would have hoped that we would have gotten a chance to do that. We didn't. I want to go back to that. I want to look at it in the legislature. The other piece of this for the budget, though, is single-payer health care. Since health care costs are such a huge part of this formula, we need to do a better job of containing those costs, and I favor a single-payer system to do that.
This is honestly one of the biggest failures in the legislature that I can think of in years. They've known the problem since October 2015, as you mentioned. There were work going on between the House and the Senate to come up with solutions. Sonia Chang Diaz's bill that she was pushing and got passed through the Senate would have actually made a movement on all 4 dimensions, funding some, but also making a firm commitment to fund all 4 areas over time. To me, it's absolutely unconscionable, particularly given the pressure that we have on our budgets. And you're seeing communities like Brockton actually sue now because they're viewing this as being like it was back during the education reform movement back in '93, where if you don't know, that came about because there were lawsuits saying that the fundamental promise of the Massachusetts Constitution of education for all was being broken, and being broken in a way that was legally actionable. And many people think we're actually getting close to that now as well. So I think we need to move forward with the Chang Diaz's approach. I think we can organize organizations like the Massachusetts Association of School Committees and the Mass Municipal Association, as well as the legislators, to get broader awareness of the practical impact this is having on communities. Given the fact that there was $1 billion revenue surplus at the end of this fiscal year, I'm not giving up hope that we can't make beginnings of a multi-year down payment, even in advance of a progressive income tax or fair share amendment. So I would like to see a 3 or 4 year phase-in which by next year we have an additional increase of $250 or $300 million. But I also do agree with the progressive income tax. I think in the end, we're going to need that, particularly because even when you fund Chapter 70 appropriately, you're still not doing all the other things we need to do to invest in our schools appropriately.
So the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center has suggested several ways to generate the funds to address some of these inequities. And I think the key piece in all of their recommendations is incremental change. So that we start it, and every year we actually fulfill more and more of the promise, so that by 2023, 2024, it's filled. We have to keep that. If you want more information on what Senator Chang Diaz has done, which has been phenomenal, I recommend going to her Facebook page. She has a great video where she talks about not only the commission report, which she chaired, but what happened as a result of the House leadership closing it down. This also raises the issue of transparency in the State House, particularly when things just sort of die and nobody knows why. And we're told 2/3 of the representatives support it, and yet it never came to the floor. So as a progressive Democrat, one of the things I hope to do is try to chip away at that and make the Democratic Party more progressive in the State House, and this would be a good example for us to test it out on.
As we move forward to this coming January and we start debating our budget here in the Amherst Regional School District, we can already see, based on conversations that are going on, a virtual war coming between the four towns over how we assess and pay for our school budgets. The reality is the system's broken, and it's burdening our towns. It's dividing us in ways that might even threaten the viability of our regional school district as a district over time. This needs to be an absolute top priority. And I will make, the reason I emphasize this in multiple debates, both on charter schools and on Chapter 70, the reason I do is because this is a storm that's brewing. It's hitting people all over the state. It's hurting the quality of our services. And I promise, as your state representative, I will make this my top priority.
Okay, riveting. I'm going to take a break, mental break just for a second to remind everyone that you have cards. If you don't have a card yet, you can get a card from Jennifer and Becky. Where are you? Just put your hand in the air, you'll get a card. Perhaps there's a follow-up question you want to ask on these two in some way. But in any case, just remember that you can get a card and you can give the card back to Jennifer and Becky anytime. Okay, Eric, we're going to start with you to begin this next question, which is about social justice and equity, issues of equity in education, which are perennial issues. So I think about issues of equity, or equity, as issues of access. Who gets to come? Who is included? What is included in the curriculum? Who gets access to information? And who doesn't, and why? So I think about it as access, I think about it as participation. Once you're there, who benefits on a day-to-day basis? Who contributes on a day-to-day basis? Whose values and voices are heard, and whose are not, and why? And outcomes. Ultimately, what happens for people as a result of schooling and education? Who does it happen for, to what extent, and who doesn't it happen for, and why? So how do you conceive of equity in education? Locally, what are our most pressing issues of educational equity? What can be done legislatively to ensure more equity in education?
This is more of a dissertation one again.
Have you done, you need to do a dissertation.
This is good. When a child comes through our doors, they need to be valued, respected, welcomed, supported, nurtured, and our schools need to be organized in a way that are receptive to doing that. And that's going to mean different things to different kids. I was mentioning earlier this concept of co-teaching, which, to demystify that, what it means is you have what we consider a traditional school teacher, classroom teacher, and then a special education teacher who works in the classroom directly together to try to teach the class. And they're cross-certified to be able to do that. The concept was identified to be able to mainstream children with special needs and give them as positive or high-quality environment as possible. But what it turns out is they found by doing it that it actually benefited all the kids in the classroom, and that a customized and flexible and responsive way of engaging and learning what children's needs were would benefit all the kids in the classroom. And then by having kids of different needs and abilities and in places where they were in life, the entire classroom would move forward better. I mention that as an example, or as a kind of an anecdote or whatever, because equity to me means a core commitment to valuing and recognizing the experience and needs of every child when they come in the door. And it does mean creating an environment in which, whether it's a cultural or linguistic issue, or not issue, but just who they are, whether it is their socioeconomic status, which can mean not just their money, but also literally their social status in the community, that the school does things to break those barriers down and recognize and lift up every single child. There's a lot of ways to do that, which is why we're stopping now, I guess.
We're going to have an extra couple minutes.
That's true.
You got another minute for half dissertation. It's coming.
So in terms of everything that was said, and I love the way that you put that in terms of access, participation, and outcomes. So when I think about access and participation in this district and in other districts, I also think about access to food, nutrition, health care, emotional and behavioral support, family support, and knowing that your teachers understand you so that there's adequate professional development. And I want to take a moment and just talk about one of the two of those in particular. I think every child, we should be making sure as a Commonwealth that every child has the nutrition they need to start the day and learn. People can't learn if they're hungry. And so I would want to make sure that there's breakfast after the bells programs, which means that you don't have to be at school early to get breakfast. Everybody gets breakfast in the classroom after the bell rings. Nobody's identified as the only person who's hungry or one of the few families that are hungry. Everybody gets to eat together. I would also increase the number of school meals that are actually going out. I know Amherst just misses the cutoff by allowing everybody to be able to get a school meal. I think we ought to be looking at that a little differently. When everybody gets a school meal, then nobody's singled out. And when nobody's singled out, nobody has to feel bad that they needed food from school. We need to have behavioral and emotional support in school. I know in the high school right now, they have a particular program with the social worker who provides a designated space for kids who are struggling. We need to have that K through 12. School districts need to know that they can go to the Commonwealth and be able to get grants to be able to make that happen. I mentioned professional development. I think this is critical. I've talked to a lot of families who tell me that their kids of color were identified as basketball players instead of mathematicians, even though those kids were good at math. So professional development to really bring everybody in, allow people to identify their own implicit biases, their underlying biases, and be able to explore how that translates and gets applied in their work is very, very important. And I'll continue in a moment.
One of the things I'm most excited about looking ahead to I realize I'm running for state representative, so I'm running to leave the school committee as opposed to stay on it. But one of the things I'm actually really excited about doing this coming year is developing a strategic plan, which has been a long time goal, as something that sets with the community our objectives, analyzes and makes the data transparent, and then sets measurable annual plans to try to implement our objectives or goals as a community. On equity, what that means to me is really all the things we've talked about, including in terms of professional development, restorative justice and safety, as well as also customized programs for education for kids. One of the things I'm really excited about at the elementary level here, which I think it should be supported everywhere, is the dual language elementary school that we're talking about doing. Because if you look at the concept of how that engages all the kids in learning world languages, it's really neat. And it solves a lot of the problems we're talking about.
We need to get one of those hooks, and then we could just so I also think there's a role for the Commonwealth in supporting workforce development so that our teaching and our faculty looks like our student population. And sometimes we look at that as a local role and we get frustrated because how can we do it on a local level? And I think it's actually more of a Commonwealth mission and a Commonwealth responsibility. We happen to have a wonderful school of education right here that can maybe be partners on that. So I would like to see the state do more investing in workforce development around a diverse faculty, and then try to retain those folks to be able to work in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In terms of equity, I also want to say that the restorative justice program that's going on is terrific. I think we also have to make sure, that's for Amherst, thanks to AEF, but as a Commonwealth, we really need to look at the role that disciplinary policies play in school to prison pipeline. And the Commonwealth needs to take that same kind of responsibility that AEF and Amherst has taken in making those programs happen.
Thank you. This next question is about charter schools. And Mindy, we'll start with you. So there is concern about charter schools taking money from our local traditional public schools in Amherst, Pelham, and Granby. At the same time, many citizens and parents appreciate and value the educational options that charter schools provide in arts, in language, and so forth. So what are your thoughts on charter schools? What is the value they add, if any, to the educational landscape? And what should the legislator be doing to address the issue of charter funding effects on traditional public schooling?
Well, I think the funding mechanism is unfair, and I think it has to stop. I think it's putting public education and school districts in untenable situations where they have to suffer significant losses of funds. They have to maintain certain standards, live up to certain standards that the state puts on their money, but doesn't put the same standards and the same strings on charter schools. And then they find themselves in budgetary, kind of trouble. And when you're in budgetary trouble, you start to shave those outside programs, the language programs, the arts programs. So families that want those programs, they have no choice. They have to go to a charter school because that's what's providing it. And that sort of causes a little bit of a death spiral for public education. And I'm concerned about this. And I looked up today in preparation for tonight what the vote was on keeping the cap on charter schools in Massachusetts, because I really sort of wanted to get an understanding of what the statewide response was. And it was 2/3 keep the cap, 1/3 remove the cap. So that means that 2/3 of the Commonwealth are concerned about the role that charter schools are playing right now in terms of the budgets. So I would change it. I would stop allowing charter schools to take the money without any kind of public scrutiny. I really want to point that out to you. They're able to get funds from school districts, no accountability, no transparency. School districts have to do not only accountability and transparency, they have to meet all sorts of standards for that funds. And charter schools get to take about $15,000 per student, unless you're in Pelham, and then it's even more. And they get to just take it without any kind of strings. That shouldn't be allowed. I worked for state programs in the Department of Public Health. Every contract I had strings. They had reporting, they had accountability, I had a contract manager. I had to prove that I was spending that money appropriately and on behalf of people living in the Commonwealth. So should charter schools. So take the money out of the public school education, leave it alone, leave that alone so that we can start to address that $2 billion that we're in the hole for. And then and I suggest this only because I think I'll get back to it. I'll remember.
One of the proudest things that I was involved in, two of the proudest things, that I've been involved in over the last couple of years. One was canvassing and organizing against Question 2 back in 2016. I wasn't surprised by the vote, and I wasn't surprised by the fact that in every single region of the state, you had communities voting against Question 2, lifting out the cap on charter schools, because if you go to places where they have town meetings, select boards, finance committees, and school committees, the lived experience of our neighbors all across the state is knowing that charter school funding, as it currently exists, is devastating our local schools, putting pressure on our municipal budgets and property taxes, is profoundly unfair. And by the way, it was designed to be this way from the beginning. If you go back to 1993 when the Ed Reform Act was passed, this thing was designed to penalize and damage traditional school districts. It was this whole, think like a consumer market mechanism, private, neoliberal solutions that were in fashion back then. And it was passed because they said, oh, you know what? If somebody votes with their feet, it's okay that it takes the dollars out of that school district and goes to the charter school. So I'm saying that only because what's wrong with the system isn't an accident of the system. It was actually designed into it from the beginning. It's one of the reasons why I opposed it. It's also one of the reasons why, along with the rest of the school committee, we vigorously opposed the expansion of the Pioneer Valley Chinese Immersion School, and I'm proud of the work that we did to prevent that expansion. And this is really something that's core for me, along with Chapter 70. It is something that's devastating our schools, but it's also putting an absolutely unreasonable amount of pressure on our municipal budgets and property taxes. And in places like Amherst, where we invest in special ed and in good services across the board, we get penalized even more because more money goes out the door for each child. I'll get another minute.
I'm also concerned that charter schools pit neighbors against neighbors and towns against towns. Because you have some people who are going to charter schools, their neighbors aren't. They know that this is the issue around budgets. It's wrong. We've created a system that not only is robbing public schools of their budgets, but it's robbing communities of their cohesiveness. I actually support pulling it out, creating a new budget line as part of regular appropriations. And the reason why I support that is because I want the charter school advocates to have to organize around getting public money with no accountability. I want to see how that goes. I want them to have to make the case that, in fact, in order for them to get the money, they will continue to be not transparent, cherry pick their students, et cetera, et cetera. Don't get me wrong. I totally support parents finding a school that meets their kids' needs. And I wouldn't have anything against charter schools per se, except that the way that we're funding them is robbing our public schools of their funds.
When I think of all the things that we need to do as a society, and you can go on to other things like transportation and housing, but even just in the world of education, we need to reduce public student debt and public higher education. We need universal preschool. We need to modernize our facilities and invest more in our facilities. All those things cost money. I'm not actually sure where charter schools fit in to the picture if we properly fund our schools in the way that we urgently need to. And you go back to the earlier question around equality and opportunity and the role of schools. That's the role of schools. This is the core of our community. If we don't do this well, what are we doing well and what matters? So this is a fight that we need to be in, and it's a fight we need to win. And I'm looking forward as state representative helping to lead that fight.
Thank you. Reminder, if you want to ask a question on a card, give it to Becky or Jennifer, or raise your card up if you have one written and give it to them. They will come and get it from you. This next question is about the university and relationships between the towns and the university. So there are unique dynamics to the relationship between the university and Granby, Pelham, and Amherst, including the fact that UMass produces a large number of well-educated graduates each year, many of whom would like to stay in the area, but can't find the kind of jobs they would find in Boston or other regions of the Commonwealth. What are your thoughts about the importance of UMass to the region and what the legislature could do to support economic development, to employ UMass graduates, and to foster strong town-gown relations? Eric, we start with you.
Well, I think everybody here knows UMass is absolutely essential to the economy of the region. It's the largest employer. There's enormous spending power that occurs, although not as much as it used to be. That's one of the sources of tension in town-gown relations, is that there's not as much spending downtown. But economic development is something that was a core of my work, particularly with our universities and community colleges when I worked for Governor Patrick. It's hard work, because what you have to do is you have to try to align what the centers of excellence and what the university does well and what students are graduating with where there are opportunities in the labor market locally and where there are opportunities for new job creation. So we did a number of things when I was working for Governor Patrick, and I think some of these are things that can be continued, like paid internship programs for small and medium-sized businesses, and a directory that connected folks to paid internships. We also, with the life sciences building at UMass, was organized in such a way, it's a $95 million building that's up there that I worked on, has space in it for local startups as well as small and medium-sized manufacturers to be able to do process improvements but engage with graduate students and undergraduates and faculty, and then bring those discoveries immediately back to their shop floor to be competitive. That strengthens the practical linkages between the university and area businesses and the pipeline into local business opportunities. Third thing, I just give an example, is that I also helped create a I've helped pass state legislation, rights legislation, creating an entrepreneurship program that funds, among other things, Valley Venture Meadows down in Springfield, which is an absolutely awesome DIY grassroots startup accelerator that includes students as well as other residents in the area. And it's a really great opportunity for folks who want to stay in the area but need to develop a network and a community of people to find that community, find those resources, and stay in the area when they're starting up their business, which is another idea. I think I was done, right?
Perfect.
I knew you were going to tell me. this stuff.
Perfect.
Oh, nailed
You're
it.
sensing it now. You're sensing it.
It's like a gymnast. So UMass is the economic engine. It's a really unique situation in the 3rd Hampshire District that so many people are connected to public education one way or another, either as current public school teachers, retired public school teachers, or people who are connected to the university, or people who are students at the university. And so we have all these sort of ways that we connect to public ed. They're like concentric circles, right? Because we're either it's our workplace, it's our values, it's our aspirations. I'm a big proponent for the Commonwealth to be funding small startups to stay in this area. I happened to meet a person, as Eric and I are both campaigning, in one of my turfs where I was knocking on doors and meeting voters, a person who works at the Eisenberg School, who's a teacher, who basically fronts the money, the startup money, for some of his students to start up businesses. That's wonderful and generous, but that really shouldn't be the way that startups are funded in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So there's a need there for us to be looking more specifically. This combination, though, of students being able to stay in the area and have to look for jobs after they graduate is directly tied to student debt, which prevents them from potentially taking the positions that they would want to take, which might be here, which might be lower funded than other positions because they've got this mountain of debt on their back. And so one of the ways we have to address that is we have to start looking at debt-free education, debt-free public higher ed. And for that, I think for me, part of that means a loan repayment plan for people, students particularly, who are choosing high-need positions. I'm talking social workers, counselors, nurses, health and human service providers who often don't get paid a lot. But if you have a lot of debt, there's no way you can consider those positions. But let the Commonwealth step in, repay their loans for them over a period of time. That will help them stay here. Bay State Medical Center apparently did this a couple years ago with nurses, and the nurses stayed for a minimum of 10 years. So loan repayment plans can be helpful in retaining students.
Just on that topic, I'm in favor of rebalancing state investment in public higher education in a way that makes college debt-free for all students. And if you go back a generation or two, states invested more in public higher education, even Massachusetts, but even especially places like California. There's no reason we can't go back to it. It would take a few years to do it, but I think it's absolutely critical so that anyone who wants to get a higher education can graduate without any debt. One of the key things, too, when you're thinking about connecting employers and students in this area and growing our local economy, is collapsing the perceived distance between here and Boston, which is an engine for huge economic development in the state. One way to do that is through high-speed rail east-west and a more robust regional transportation network that allows people to get there. But one of the things we also did that I would do as state representative, following the lead of UMass and following the lead of the town council in Amherst, is try to bring in resources from Boston and economic development, my old colleagues, to connect with what's happening hot here and develop more practical relationships.
So state funding of public higher education in Massachusetts is unfortunately another example of a broken promise. And it has a direct connection to student debt. So a couple of years ago, Massachusetts said they were going to pay, the state would pay 50-50. They would pay 50% of the cost of a higher education, and that would freeze tuition and fees. Baker came in and decided no. Happened a little bit before that as well. And so as a result, fees have had to increase and tuition as well. That creates debt. So we need to go back to saying, we made a promise, and the promise was we're going to split the cost of public higher education and do that so that we can reduce debt.
Okay, last formal question, and Mindy, we'll start with you on this one. So please share your approach, your intended approach to cultivating healthy interactions and two-way communications with the constituents that you'll represent. And if you can, linking it to education, and if you can, please share any thoughts you might have on how school personnel might also cultivate healthy interactions and two-way communication with the students' parents and other educational stakeholders that they serve.
Okay. I'm looking forward to this very much if I'm elected. I've already, in my campaign, I've already incorporated sort of what I would be doing on a one-on-one basis, where I've been meeting with both teachers, administrators, former school committee members, current school committee members, in phone conversation with school committee members both in Pelham, Amherst, and Granby. And this is part of the job that I am going to love, is being informed by people, reaching out, being sort of consulting with the district as to not only what the needs are, but understanding not only how I might be able to help or contribute to meeting those needs locally, but how they play out on the state level. I imagine that that will continue in terms of not only one-on-one groups, but also an open kind of communication channel. But the other thing that I'm wanting to explore is an advisory group of students between the 3 towns. I recently had, I met some kids from the high school, and we talked about issues of concern to them. Some of them were educational, some of them were voting rights, some of them were human rights, some of them were about student debt. And when I talked to them about it, I said, what would you think if you had a regular standing time with the state representative to be able to inform me of issues of concern to you? So I would pledge today that I would do that. I also pledge that I would be having office hours in each of the schools to be able to be accessible not only to the students, but to the faculty, the parents, and the community.
You have another 30 seconds.
What, another 30 seconds? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And so the second part was how can schools do it with parents and
Any
students?
thoughts you have on how school personnel might also cultivate healthy two-way communication
With their constituents or with the state rep?
with their constituents?
Well, I actually think that the schools do a pretty good job of that. In Granby in particular, they do a food program that goes out with students before the weekend, so that involves communication with parents to know which students are going to be able to get that. I see that Amherst does that all the time. I know that Amherst recently had a situation where they sent out a notice, they got feedback from the community to correct it, they did, and Pelham does that. So I think actually I could learn something from the schools around that.
Thank you.
So one of the most enjoyable parts of being a candidate, which may actually surprise you, is going door to door and going out and meeting people and listening to them. And it's an absolutely enriching activity, enjoyable, but also one of the things you do is you learn how diverse the needs of our community are. And I mean, however, whatever is your mind right now about what that means, magnify it. In this town, there are subdivisions behind subdivisions. and there are people who we don't always see, who may need our help, and probably do. So to me, one of the things I really admire about the work of Ellen Story and Stan Rosenberg was that they, one, were everywhere. You see them at all sorts of events, which is important to be able to engage with all different kinds of groups and hear from them, but it's also important because it gives an opportunity for someone to get direct access to their state representative. I think the other thing to me is being able to respond to concerns that people have absolutely immediately and troubleshoot them as quickly as you can. One of the things I enjoyed doing when I worked for Governor Patrick was going into places, meeting with a diverse group of community groups or businesses and educators, hear their concerns, and then try to figure out how to tie those back to state resources. It's one of the things I did locally for the Hitchcock Center and for also the investment in a roundabout up in the north part of town that's near Kendrick Place. But it's something that's actually enjoyable to do, but when you're doing it, you recognize how disconnected we often feel from government. The agencies are alien and foreign, and the question is, how do we connect people and make them feel like these organizations are working for them? I think that's one of the critical jobs of a state representative and something I'm looking forward to doing.
I have close to 30 years, don't like to admit that all the time, experience building coalitions and working with others to identify problems, create solutions, and move to results. And for me, a lot of constituent service is doing just that. It's listening to people about what their problems and their issues are and brainstorming with them or with other strategic partners around how to meet those needs. So part of that, sometimes that happens on a one-on-one basis, sometimes that happens in a group basis. But it always, for me, it's the basic part of not only this job, but it's been the basic part of almost every job that I've had for the past several decades, is working with other people to understand what their needs are and help make sure that government is there to respond to it. Whether you're a person in a drug and alcohol treatment program, a person coming into the Amherst Survival Center because you need food, or a person that is a provider in a jail or a detox program, you need to know that your elected official is listening to you and being able to respond. Ellen was fantastic because she was everywhere, because that allowed people to know they could call her. And I would want that to be my legacy as well.
You can't have an impact on legislation or programs if you're, or whatever the issue is, if you're not at the table. One of the things that I became acutely aware of when I worked for Governor Patrick was that we went into a community and we went into City Hall and we worked on something that, and often there were community development initiatives that were touching people in the community, people of color, low-income folks. They weren't represented at the table frequently. And what I learned is that we had the power to change that when we were coming in. As for the governor, we could basically say, you know, I want to get a different set of voices. I want to make sure that the people who are at the table look like the community and represent a broad set of stakeholders in the community. To me, that's something we have to do as a community as well. As good as the schools are at engaging with folks, it's something that the schools have to continue to refresh, how to do that better and better. So to me, I think there's an ethical obligation as a leader to think about how you do your work and what impact you're having, not just on people who are there, but also the people who are not there and need to be brought in.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So now we'll do audience questions. We'll have a slight transition break here where I'm going to get the cards from that are collected. I'm going to mix them up so they're not in any particular order, and I'm going to go through and make sure I can read them and make sure they weren't already asked. So if you all could take a minute or two to talk to a new neighbor and say hi to your neighbors and process a little bit with each other, that would be great. Hi, neighbor. Microphone.
Oh, you're welcome. That's fantastic. I remember that moment. That's great.
All right. Maybe we met someone new. Maybe we just fanned ourselves vigorously. I'm trying not to move at all. Sweat will come down. Okay, great. So one thing to note is that we probably won't get through all the cards. However, we commit to, AEF, me, we commit to getting Mindy and Eric copies of all of these so that they can see all the comments and the questions that were asked. Okay?
Oh, wow.
Would you like to borrow it? I'm happy to.
I took my jacket off.
I'll share it with you.
You need to oscillate, though. Can you oscillate? Okay. She's an oscillator. All right. The question, how this will work is I'll read the question, and then we'll do 2 minutes and 2 minutes with no additional 1 minute, so we can do more questions that way. And we started with Mindy on the last question, so we'll start with you, Eric, on this one, okay? It is unfortunate that we now have to consider safety as a primary concern when discussing schools and education. What are your thoughts about safety in the educational system, and how can we best address safety concerns?
Well, this is one of the most disturbing issues we have right now. What startled me, I remember going to the student walkout this past spring, and as the students were gathering in the parking lot and going through their speeches, I had a chill all of a sudden when I looked at the group and realized that it was a moment where they could be targets, even at that very moment. Students have talked to the school committee and talked to us a lot about their concerns about this. Our schools are locked up, meaning they're secure. The entries are secure. Our school district goes through regular drills, and I know those things are done statewide. Honestly, I think some of the issues we need around school safety come outside of the schools. They come about how we're dealing with violence and guns in our society generally. And I strongly believe that we need to advocate for gun control nationally, gun buybacks here, pass everything we can, like red flag laws that can reduce incidents of violence. And then I think, even though I think this is a cop-out from Republicans nationally, I think it's important that we engage in wellness support for people generally and improve mental health treatment so that we can, and the stigmatization around it, so that we can create a society in which we can reduce the circumstances under which people are may slip through the cracks and act out in ways that are obviously extremely disturbing and antisocial and violent.
Well, today I found out that I got an F from the NRA. And I filled out that application specifically because I wanted someone from the NRA to read it. And I'm not afraid of getting an F from the NRA. And it's a gun access issue, and it's also a social and emotional health issue in schools. I favor the Commonwealth providing funding for school districts to sort of address the problem as if it was a public health problem. So when it's a public health problem, first of all, you screen. You reduce the factors that sort of contribute to the problem. And in this case, that would be levels of bullying and discrimination, efforts to improve the school climate. I'm very proud of both my daughters, I just want to say that, but my younger daughter, when she was in the high school, did a lot of work around improving the school climate at the Amherst Regional High School, and I could not be prouder of the work that she did there because it was inclusive and it was effective. And that's what we have to do. We have to fund and support inclusive, effective programs, and then we have to remove the environmental hazard that's causing the problem, and that's guns that are not appropriate. We have to proactively try to stop gun violence, and we need to be able to partner as a Commonwealth with the School of Public Health at UMass to do the research that's necessary to build the best practices so that we can have safe schools that don't have necessarily metal detectors and locked doors, which actually don't work. So.
Thank you. All right, next question. I'm watching terrible misogyny coming out of DC. How does your gender affect your candidacy? How does your gender influence your thoughts about your approach on education issues? And Mindy will start with the first.
What was the first part of the question?
Yes. How does your gender affect your candidacy? How does your gender influence your thoughts about your approach on education issues?
So my thoughts on education, I'll take that one first, come from both my experience in the world of adult learning and in being a health educator, and also being a parent. I've gone through a total of like 24 years of elementary school and high school, and if you added up both kids, and I've had experiences being able to observe what's happening and what prompts me to advocate, what prompts me not to advocate, I've had values clarification moments of what I think are the most important things for my kids to have, and what I think are important for all kids to have. So as a parent and as a mother, I guess, in terms of the gender-related question, that really does form some of what I think in terms of what's necessary for children and for parents as families. But as a professional, I also sort of bring that to it. In terms of my candidacy, in the beginning, people asked me if I was running as a woman. Yes, I am. I've got one woman, but there's so much more to me to be able to vote for me than just being a woman. I bring a lot of skills, experience. I have a lot of results. I have a lot of relationships that I've built over many years that I'm very proud of in terms of work relationships to really move us as a society to advance goals and priorities. Did I do that as a woman? Yes, because I am a woman. But is it because I'm a woman? Maybe. Maybe my process is different, and if I was a man, I wouldn't have the same process. That's probably true. But for me, this is who I am, right here. I'm comfortable in my own skin. I'm coming to you. I'm a candidate for state rep from the 3rd Hampshire District. I am a woman. I'm also a coalition builder, an advocate, a public health trainer, a former congressional aide, the executive director of the Amherst Survival Center, and I am also a woman. So that's what
Well, I mean, I am a man, and I'm also,
Are you running as a man?
I'm just running as me, which probably includes being a man. I'm also a minority, and I'm affected by that too. When I worked in state government, which I did, as I talked about, I did for 9 years, I saw firsthand a couple things. I mean, one, I'm talking on Beacon Hill. One, that my favorite colleagues were often women. We had extraordinary leadership in our executive office of women who are some among the finest professionals that I've ever met, and just finest public servants I've ever met. What I think you have to do, and I think as a man I am aware of this, is of understanding and becoming more acquainted with the power dynamics that exist within workplaces that belittle or diminish or marginalize women all the time. And on Beacon Hill, oftentimes try to exploit them sexually. I mean, sexual harassment and assault are significant issues. And what I realize, and something I do bring to this campaign, and something to my values, is that, and we talked about this actually before in another debate, is that I know that in the same way I talked earlier about the power dynamics of who's in the room, you also have to be mindful and you have to own your own responsibility for the power dynamics of how other people are being treated around you, what power you have to shape a more equal and open room, or again, by room I mean decision-making place or work environment, and it's something I take very seriously. I'm lucky I was raised in a matriarchal, multi-generational matriarchal family, so to me, and my sort of coded into my DNA, was the notion that women are natural leaders, just like anyone else. But we have to bring that and do it.
Thank you. We're going to keep going. We agreed, remember?
I know.
We did. Okay. Okay, next question. A number of us in this area have paid into state retirement or teachers' retirement instead of Social Security. So we are depending on these funds for retirement. Will you commit to ensuring the solvency of these retirement systems? And this is for you first.
Absolutely. I don't know if people saw this the other day, but there's some articles about how bankruptcies and foreclosures among seniors have doubled over the last 20 years, and that's corresponded with the elimination of the creation of 401ks and the elimination of defined benefit retirements. We need single payer, Medicare for all. We need actually to move back to having annuity plans or defined benefit retirement plans for everyone, for more people. We've got to find a way to create those systems. I'd love to advance that on a state level. It's a core issue of family and household security and of fairness in society. Now, getting on to teachers. By the way, I actually have a vested state pension, and my pension would probably be at risk as well as the teachers in this room who are worried about it for themselves. Oh my gosh, you don't have any Social Security. I don't have any Social Security. This is a core commitment, and it is inviolable. I know that there are people at administration and finance in the state who have been trying to figure out ways to get around this, saying, oh, maybe this contract has to be enforced constitutionally. Forget it. This is one of those things I'd fight tooth and nail, as well as work on creatively to ensure it gets funded, and have the resources to fund it. But as I said, it's not just a core commitment to you and teachers and other state workers and municipal workers. It's also because this is the first step of something we need to do much more broadly as a society to reduce economic inequality and improve people's felt sense of security. It's absolutely essential that we do that. This is a key priority.
I believe that access to health care, food, a good paying job in safe conditions, and a secure retirement are human rights. That's what I start with. And I absolutely support making sure that faculty and teachers' retirement are intact, that promise is kept. As I said before, I'm not interested in broken promises. I'm interested in keeping promises, both to our children, our families, and our teachers, period. That's all I have to say on that, so I'm going to take my extra couple minutes to talk about the other thing. I just want to say something on the gender issue, though. In Massachusetts right now, the State House is 75% male and 25% female. And I want to remind us all, it's 2018, and about 51% of the population is female, and 49% is male. So there's a little bit of an imbalance there. We've read a lot of stories that are going on in major newspapers this year about all the women that are running. I do want to recommend, if you listen to podcasts, there's a great podcast from last week from The Daily that talks about the last time there were this many women running, and it was right after the Clarence Thomas hearings with Anita Hill. And there's a connection, because when we see that, in fact, women are demeaned we get mad. And when we get mad, we get active. We shouldn't have to get mad to get active, but that's what happens. And for a lot of women, that's why we're running, because we're mad.
Okay, next question. How will you address the inequities in public education in our district? For instance, Black students are still underrepresented in honors and AP courses at the high school, for example. What can be done at the state level to change things like this? And Mindy, we start with you.
I think that's a great question. And I'm not sure I have all the answers for tonight, but it's a question that you're going to give us the questions for us to sort of do our due diligence on as well. But I think a large part of that is professional training. And I'm not blaming teachers in this. I think that we need to be able to support teachers to understand the ways in which they may track students in certain ways, and also understand what are the best practices to stop doing that. I'm a big believer in best practices. It may be because of my public health background, but I think sometimes we're not aware of the ways that we are, not only in the field of education, in any field, presuming things about people and assuming things about people. And so those kind of professional development opportunities that focus on the workforce, I think, can be helpful, as well as opportunities that can bring families and faculty together to do exactly what we're talking about in terms of sharing information about culture, each other, and just learn from each other. Not only teacher to community, also community to teacher.
This is really a major issue, and it's something that on the school committee, I don't know how many times we've talked about this, but it drives me nuts. It's one of the things when I talked earlier about doing a strategic plan this coming year, one of the things I've really wanted to focus on is getting good data and understanding where there are gaps in students of color taking advantage of AP courses and other accelerated learning opportunities, and try to set a plan to try to close those gaps where they exist and find best practices to do that. I think it's just absolutely critical to do. One of the things I think needs to happen statewide, though, is we need to dial back the emphasis on the MCAS and high-stakes testing. As long as we're teaching to the test, have mandated curriculum, and the schools are essentially over-regulated with expectations around what they're doing, you don't have as much time, and I've seen this a lot on the school committee, that setting aside the committee, the district itself, the teachers sort of race forward all the things they have to do, and all the reporting requirements, and all the mandated things that have to be done, and there's not as much time to step back and take a look at what's going on globally in the schools and engage in creative solutions. Now, the art district, I think, does a lot of good work on that, but the reality is I think we need this whole child learning. We need to be focusing on the whole child, and we need to reorient. We need a new progressive education reform movement that could do that. And it's actually a good opportunity for me to say that on my website, I have a 10-point progressive education platform that I put out around a month ago that covers a lot of these things, because I think it needs to be done comprehensively. I talked about money earlier. Money is absolutely critical, but it's not all about money. It's also about how we're framing up expectations in our schools and the burdens and regulations we're putting down on the schools, too.
Thank you. Eric, we're going to start with you on this one. How do you feel about community service programs like City Year and SCA, the Student Conservation Association, that give students the opportunity to give to their communities and earn college tuition? Amherst Regional High School does not actively encourage these things, according to this writer.
Okay.
So how do you feel about community service programs like City Year and SCA that give students the opportunity to give to their communities and earn college tuition?
I think two things. I mean, one, I don't think they're a solution for properly funding scholarship and grant aid and reducing the cost of public higher education. So if somebody has an opportunity to get money and advance themselves through doing service learning, that's great. I think we need to do more to improve access generally in our society. I say that only because if you think about a lot of the programs Bill talked about doing, sort of civilian service akin to military service over the years, a lot of time that's been talked about in terms of getting like a GI Bill and the way people affording college. I think we need to make college more accessible generally than we do now. On service learning, I mean, I've known plenty of people, particularly in Boston where I worked, who have been involved in service learning programs for youth, and they've gotten a lot out of it. They've had an opportunity to do professional leadership and development and really develop their skills in ways that are very powerful. And I think it could be a great thing.
Is the question about community service programs or service learning programs?
Both. How do you,
I was taking the city year angle on it.
how do you feel about community service programs like City Year and SCA?
I like community service programs. I think for some kids, that's how they're going to engage and develop skills and their passion and their direction. I'm not in favor of a cookie cutter approach, although generally speaking, and I think for some kids, either it's music and arts that's engaging them, that could be in the school, or it might be outside in the world, helping to build trails or demolish walls. I'm not necessarily personally opposed to them, and I wouldn't necessarily want my view to be imposed on the Amherst Regional High School. So if the ARHS doesn't have it, that's their prerogative as a school to do it. As an elected official, I likely would support funding or at least supporting those kinds of programs as engaging more students. But I wouldn't necessarily think that my view should supplant the principal's view or the school committee's view.
Great. All right, last question that I can get to, and you will get copies of all the questions. Before you will make any closing remarks that you'd like to make. This is, tell us something you're proud of and tell us something you wish went better. And I think Mindy,
Oh my God, I think it is me. Something I wish went better. I'm very proud of the work that I did when I worked for the Department of Public Health as a regional coordinator for HIV counseling and testing in Western Massachusetts. It was my first job in Western Mass. I was living in the Berkshires, and I not only had direct contact with people who were getting HIV tested through counseling, but I was able to also use those in-person kind of communications to think about what else was needed in the area. I also oversaw other counselors so we could together combine what were we hearing from people, what did they need, what did they want, and then we went and we sort of developed a series of like a service infrastructure for people living with HIV and AIDS and their family that people could use, and this was sort of in the late 80s to 90s. I'm very proud of that. It sort of set the foundation, for lack of a better word, for HIV-related services in Western Massachusetts, and it was used as a model for rural counties throughout the country. One thing I wish could have done a little bit better, right now at the Amherst Survival Center, we have a program working with medical providers to screen every patient for food security. I wish we had more doctors doing it. We have a lot of pediatricians doing it, but not a lot of family practitioners, and I wish that that program could reach people who talk with adults as well as it's reaching with people who talk to kids.
Thank you.
So one of the things I'm proud of is, if people, I don't know if people are aware of this, but at least over the years, the connection between vocational education, our community colleges, and area employers and then people who are looking for new careers had essentially broken down, particularly in some industries like advanced manufacturing, which you may be surprised to learn is actually growing. But that's not the only one. It's also true for culinary arts, information technology, a number of areas. And one of the things that I did in a team setting to lead during the Patrick administration was working with local stakeholders, including businesses, workforce boards, community colleges, vocational schools, and then legislators to understand where the gaps were. Sometimes it was facilities, sometimes it was seed grants to help develop partnerships, other times it was tuition support. Other times it was actually that they weren't reaching out and didn't understand their market, so they weren't reaching out to particularly minorities and people of color. This is a real problem in manufacturing, which has often been an overly white profession. So what we did is we developed a strategy. I helped draft legislation for a program that helped rebuild many of these training facilities. And really the thing that on the front end, you hear about the problems. You know there's a need for people who need jobs. You talk to companies that need to hire. On the back end, to me, the greatest thing in the world was going to some of the graduation ceremonies, like up at Franklin Tech or down in Springfield, and meeting people whose lives have been transformed because they now have skills that they need to get a good job in the area, and they're connected to a company in the area that's paying good wages for them. And the pride when you'd see families come together for those graduations was moving. It made everything worthwhile because oftentimes I'm very buttoned down. I seem like a policy nerd, and that's kind of what I am. But at heart, what this is about is making sure that we can reach people and support them and connect them in ways that lift them up. And I'm proud to have done that.
Okay, so we're now going to move to a closing statement, and we're going to have about up to 2 minutes to make closing remarks. And Eric, we're going to have you go first and give Mindy the last word since you had the first word. So we're going to start with you.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for hosting. I really appreciate the fact that the final forum is on second to final forum, I guess it is, but final week is spent on public education. This is a subject that for me is not only deeply personal, not just what I said at the beginning, but also coming from a family of school teachers and sitting around multi-generationally talking about teacher contracts and pay and retirement and things like that, but also what was happening in our schools and our community. I can really think of nothing more important for us to fight for and advocate for, not me, because the representative ultimately is just one person. It's our community. All of us coming together, identifying the resources that we need, new school buildings, new programs, and then working collectively to identify the resources or advocate for new legislation to be able to meet our needs. That's the kind of work I've done in the past, and you can read about it on the website. You can also read about the platform. What I want to tell you is I'm proud of the work I've done. I'm proud of the skills I've developed. I think I can be an effective state representative. Particularly think that's meaningful with the turnover we've had in our legislative delegation. But at heart, particularly on this night, what I want you to know is I'm going to work with you tirelessly to advance progressive education legislation and policies. And if one thing doesn't work, then the next thing will work. If that doesn't work, we'll keep at it, we'll be creative, we'll be persistent, and I promise we'll get the job done working together. I'd love to have your vote on September 4th, and more importantly, your partnership afterwards working together. Regardless who you're, I see a lot of buttons in the room, so regardless of who you're voting for, when and if I win, I want to sit down, have a cup of coffee, and work together.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. And Election Day is Tuesday. Polls open at 7 and they close at 8, just as a reminder. Here are my priorities where it concerns public education. I support implementing the recommendations of the 2015 Foundation Commission, revising the funding formula to reflect actual costs and provide school districts with the resources they need to teach every student in the Commonwealth and to transport them to and from school. I want full funding for public education, and I want to work on the ways we can raise revenue in Massachusetts to make that happen. Addressing our school budget shortfalls means we need to deal with the reality that charter schools are draining much-needed resources from our public schools and our towns with no public scrutiny. I will fight to keep the cap on the number of charter schools. I also believe that since charter schools receive public funds, they must be subject to public scrutiny, accountability, and governance. I am committed to responding to student hunger. I want school districts to have the resources for a 21st century education for every child. I want school districts to be able to access state funds to offer support for the emotional and social health of their students, to improve their school climate, assess and revise their disciplinary policies. I want a 3-year moratorium on high-stakes testing. Instead, I want Massachusetts to be a leader in alternative assessments that do not divert necessary time or resources from the educational experience. And I want every child to start their learning day with the nutrition they need to be active and engaged learners by supporting breakfast after the bell and universal school-based meals. I see education as pre-K through 16, and I will work for tuition-free public community colleges and trade schools and debt-free public higher education. I will always acknowledge what I don't know, and I will reach out for consultation and concerns. An African proverb reads, "Rain does not fall on one roof alone." We are at a crossroads, and we are in it together. I would be honored to have your vote on September 4th.
And that is the formal conclusion of tonight's, our event tonight. I want to thank Mindy and Eric so much for being such terrific candidates for the position. We are very fortunate to have you both here among us talking about this issue. So just a really